Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this EPC policy dialogue, looking at the impact of the devastating earthquake on the forthcoming elections in Turkey. This event is part of the EPC's Global Turkey project. Turkey's elections on the 14th of May are really important. Firstly, for the people of Turkey, but also for the world, because they will have an important international and geopolitical implications. I think we can fairly say that what happens in Turkey doesn't stay in Turkey. So today we are going to be doing a deep dive into the election, into the campaigns, the strategies, challenges, possible outcomes, the impact on EU-US ties, and also on other foreign policy areas. And we're also going to look at how the earthquake, this earthquake left 50,000 people dead and destroyed around 11 Turkish regions, how they're impacting the election campaigns. Will this be the end of Erdoğan after 2 decades? I think is the $1 million question, which we can't give the answer to yet, of course. But I'm joined by 2 really great experts who know everything there is to know, I think, about Turkish politics and foreign policy and whatnot. By Berk Esen, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Sabancı Universities, and also hopefully by Nazlan Ertan Erbejce, who is a journalist, an editor, a moderator, and much more. She's currently having some technical issues, but I hope that she's going to be able to join us very shortly. Just to the audience, please can you put your questions into the Q&A box or click on the hand icon, and then we can hear your voice, which is always very nice. I would like to encourage you to do this, right from the beginning of this discussion, so I can put your questions to our speakers, as I'm going through this conversation. So I want to start, and as you're the only one there, Berk, I will start with you. So I want to start with the devastating earthquake. Can you give us, a picture of the situation on the ground today?
Well, first of all, let me begin by thanking you for this very kind invitation and very generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here. In terms of the earthquake, of course, I haven't been to the region since the earthquake had taken place. Interesting enough, I was actually visiting Hatay 1 week before the earthquake hit the area, so I'm somewhat familiar how the situation was prior to the earthquake. But it's very clear, based on what I've been following, as well as based on people who have been volunteering in the region, that this has been a devastating earthquake that affected 10 regions. 10 regions that host, more than 12 million people. Of course, not every single one of these urban dwellers have been affected, but it's very clear that the damage has been quite comprehensive. We have some districts in the area in places like Gaziantep, Kahramanmaraş, Adıyaman, as well as Hatay. Certain districts have been demolished almost completely. 70% of these districts have been demolished. In some cases, the buildings have come down completely. In other cases, they are too damaged to be used in the near future. We have already close to 2.5 million citizens who had left the earthquake damaged area, which of course is a substantial figure. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are currently living in container cities or tent cities. So the damage has been very clear. And of course, this is going to have enormous political impact as we head into the campaign season. But of course, both in the short term, but also long term, I think it's going to have a huge economic toll. The early reports that I've read so far suggest that the damage has been more than $100 million US dollars. Probably the real figure is even higher in terms of the human capital loss, the the loss of industrial production, as well as obviously the physical destruction. So this is, quite possibly the largest disaster that has hit Turkey since basically the beginning of the Turkish Republic. So basically, this is really a devastating earthquake.
And could you maybe assess the international response to the earthquake? I mean, very briefly, particularly the EU. I mean, yesterday there was a donor conference for Turkey and Syria in Brussels, where I think $7 billion were raised. How would you assess the the response of the EU, and how do you think it sort of played into Turkey's relationship? I mean, we know for a very long time it's been a very difficult and problematic relations. Has it sort of reinvigorated this relationship to some extent?
I don't think that the donor conference reinvigorated the Turkish-EU relations, at least not until the election. I think out of the 7 billion euros that have been pledged to both countries, 6 billion amount would come to Turkey. But of course, this is not a very substantial figure, considering the scale of the destruction. As I already mentioned, it's probably above $100 billion dollars worth of damage, even by a conservative estimate. My sense is that the EU member states are not necessarily coming through right away with their donor pledges, because they want to hedge their bets. So I don't think that this money is going to come to Turkey anytime soon, certainly not until the election. So I doubt that it's really going to change the political dynamics. Now, if Erdoğan, if Erdoğan is to win the upcoming presidential elections, maybe we may see more money flowing in Turkey's way. Of course, if the opposition wins, probably even more substantial amount of donor money is going to flow into Turkey. But until the election, I doubt that things are going to change dramatically. And my sense is that not just EU member states, but also US and maybe even some countries in the Middle East, they are hedging their bets because it's quite clear, looking at both the political situation on the ground as well as the opinion polls, this is going to be a close election. And I doubt that countries, or at least governments that have had quarrels with Erdoğan administration over the last 5 years are going to take a dramatic step to help Erdoğan win the election. So that's why 6 billion is not a very low figure, but it's also not a very high figure. And regardless of the amount, I don't think that money is going to kick in until the election. So it's not going to help boost Erdoğan's electoral prospects. Russia and maybe Gulf states, that might be a different story. But vis-a-vis Turkish-EU relations, I don't expect a significant turnaround until the election.
So Erdoğan won't be able to use this money to facilitate his, building back campaign that he keeps talking about. I mean, he's talked about rebuilding houses within 1 year. I mean, that seems like an incredibly ambitious or unrealistic timeline, not least because these buildings need to be built back this time with correct, under the correct laws and structures, not rebuilt to fall down again in the next earthquake. But maybe I can just start by asking you a bit about Erdoğan's campaign. I mean, first of all, I mean, given that the constitution only allows for 2 terms as a president, how come he's able to run for a 3rd time?
Well, he can run for a 3rd time because the Turkish political system has become quite authoritarian over the past decades. Unfortunately, the judiciary is captured by the ruling bloc. So you basically do not have an independent judiciary that can actually enforce the electoral law and prevent Erdoğan from running for office a 3rd time. So this is certainly an illegal act that he is committing, but of course we don't unfortunately have an autonomous institution, and certainly not an independent judiciary that can really prevent this from happening. And again, unfortunately, the opposition parties, and particularly Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's CHP, the main opposition party, has not really turned this into a major political issue. I think they've had a time to really raise this issue over the past year. They decided not to do so, probably realizing that even if they were to make a fuss about it, the High Election Council, which consists of judges, mostly promoted by the ruling party, will not necessarily take a decision against Erdoğan, and that the opposition would look like a, party that is afraid of Erdoğan running for the election. So they basically made the political call into not really turning this into a major popular issue. And with the system, particularly the judiciary being under the strong control of the government, there's really nobody to prevent this from happening.
Now, Erdoğan, I mean, in the AKP, I mean, they're running behind in the polls. I think Erdoğan is a few points behind the Kemal Bey, which is the first time that's happened for, well, forever, quite honestly. So what are Erdoğan's, tactics going to be now? I mean, what can he do to turn the picture around? Because, I mean, obviously he wants to win at any cost. So what are the measures he can do? How is he going to boost his damaged image? I mean, is it actually possible that he can?
Well, first of all, let me just point out that I take those opinion polls with a grain of salt, because, those are really early polls. And especially over the past year, I've come across polls that really reflect very different figures. And so many of these polling agencies, they have close ties to different political parties. And depending on where those parties stand, these polling companies tend to, I think, manipulate their figures. So that's why I think a better strategy would be to, rather than look at an individual poll, is to take an average of these polls so that you get a more reliable, accurate assessment. And when you do that, my sense is that, well, it's very clear that this is going to be the toughest election battle of Tayyip Erdoğan's political career. And that says something, because, he's been in office since late 2002, give and take, early 2003. So it's been now more than 20 years. And he's always had an easy time defeating Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and the main opposition party. So he himself, as well as his party, has established this electoral hegemony, which seems to be eroding over the past 2 years for various reasons. Defections from his ruling coalition, the ongoing economic crisis, which the government failed to really address, corruption allegations, incompetence on the part of the ruling coalition, the inefficiencies of the current presidential system, and on top of that, now the earthquake. So this is going to be a very, very difficult campaign for Erdoğan. But my sense is that the election is still too close to call. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and the opposition camp have their own problems, weak spots. So even though it seems that the opposition has the momentum and the opposition base seems to be very energized, that they are on the verge of an election victory, I think it still is early to make a definitive prediction. Now, how can Erdoğan still win? I think he still has a winning path, although that path is becoming a bit narrower. The earthquake, of course, created a set of risks for Erdoğan, the economic toll, the incompetence, the sheer loss of life, the magnitude of the destruction. But it gives Erdoğan, paradoxically, an advantage as well. And the advantage is, until the election, our expectation was that the opposition was going to run on the ongoing economic crisis and was going to suggest that, Turkey needs to return to a parliamentary system. Now, the earthquake, I think, is going to really change the terms of this political debate quite dramatically. And it's really in the best interest of Erdoğan to sideline all of these other issues and focus on the earthquake. And we know what he's going to run on. He's going to say that this is the biggest disaster of century that Turkey faced. No government could have really done anything about it. At least, could not have done anything to really prevent it. But that the government is now providing disaster relief efforts. And that, like you mentioned a moment ago, he's going to promise to build back all of these buildings that have been demolished within the next year, and that in order to do that, people need to vote for Erdoğan. We need a strong government for the tough times ahead, and as long as he can really make this message credible through his partisan media, using the uneven playing field in the country, he will try to sell this message. So I think that is going to be one thing that he's going to do. He has already been following what could consider to be economically populist measures, increasing the government payroll. For instance, just a couple of days ago, he promised to hire 45,000 new teachers. He's been, his government has been hiring new civil servants, public figures who are going to be on the government payroll. His government has increased the minimum wage levels, lowered the retirement age. All of these measures are going to bring him a few votes here and there. Now, will it be enough to really offset the substantial support that he lost as a result of the economic crisis? We'll see, but he's certainly going to take these measures on top of this Build Back campaign. And I think we shouldn't lose track of the fact that Turkey has an electoral authoritarian regime. So the campaign will be, the upcoming elections will neither be free nor fair. The opposition is going to face an uphill battle running against the government. 90% of the national media is now controlled by pro-government companies. The bureaucracy is going to mostly side with Erdoğan. So he already has a set of structural advantages, and he's going to use them to basically portray Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu as this ineffective, uncharismatic, weak, old politician who's out of touch with the masses. And so, he'll try to run on that message, as we head into the campaign season. Now, he doesn't really have a clear path to attaining 50% majority in the first round. So probably his calculation is to, his expectation is that the opposition camp will get divided between different candidates. And certainly the pro-government media is going to really push for this outcome to materialize. So Erdoğan's hope would be to advance the presidential elections to a second round, win the parliamentary majority, so that during that 2-week period, Erdoğan would still be able to say, look, I control the parliament. You don't want a divided government at a difficult time in Turkish history. I'm the safe choice. Vote for me as opposed to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. It's a narrow path, but I think that path is still available to him.
And could you maybe just give us a picture? Because I mean, some of those listening in might not follow Turkey that closely. I mean, of the voter base of Erdoğan. I mean, who are going to be now his key voters? Because I mean, where the earthquakes took place, I mean, that was a large support base for him in the AKP. So apart from that, where would the other votes come from? I mean, is he and the AKP going to try and make new alliances? I mean, Turkey's all about alliances these days, right? Because they have obviously still the good old reliable partner, the MHP. But where can they take other votes from that can help boost the party and his candidature? Because it's not clear to me how they will manage that.
Well, I mean, I think this is basically your question actually suggests or demonstrates the difficulty that Erdoğan is going to face. He certainly has a very loyal base. It's basically an amalgamation of the urban poor voters who have been supported by social assistance programs run by the national government, as well as AKP municipalities, certainly until the 2019 local elections, when the opposition scored some major victories in metropolitan areas. It was AKP local governments that were running the mayoral seats, and they were really distributing substantial amounts of social assistance to the urban poor. So he still retains a large chunk of that. Obviously, the conservative pious Islamist masses across the country, particularly in sparsely populated Anatolian provinces, which gives him an advantage in the parliamentary elections, because in parliamentary elections, the sparsely populated Anatolian provinces are overrepresented, and and the economic crisis has not hit those areas as much as it hit large metropolitan areas. So Erdoğan still retains that base to a certain extent. Of course, his party formed this alliance with the Turkish ultranationalist MHP going back to late 2016, early 2017, which cost him some Kurdish conservative votes. But of course, he drew some Turkish ultranationalist support. So this is his base. I think his core base is around 40%. Now, can he really expand that support? It's a tough battle for him, because the demographics is really against him. The demographic change in the country, which is a growing portion of the electorate lives in major cities. It's younger, on average, better educated than their parents' generation. And of course, these voters tend to be more on the opposition camp than in the ruling party's camp. So Erdoğan is definitely experiencing difficulty expanding that base, but he's not losing substantial support. I think his base is fairly strong. He has attempted to expand his ruling, his electoral alliance over the past couple of weeks, has not necessarily met with much success. So I don't know if he can really, add new parties to his coalition. But so far, he's not really experiencing major defections either. So it really comes down to, so I think it's not so much, how many voters Erdoğan will be able to mobilize, but rather how many voters the opposition will be able to mobilize against Erdoğan. Because at this point in Turkish politics, I would say speculatively that the largest party is the anti-Erdoğan party. The problem is the opposition has had difficulty finding one figure who will be able to unify that anti-Erdoğan vote. And the moment you start discussing individual figures, Kılıçdaroğlu, of course, now the joint candidate, they're having difficulty retaining that very diverse anti-Erdoğan coalition. Because the Erdoğan coalition is not growing, but it's not shrinking either. And that's why I think this is going to be a close election to follow.
So maybe you can just elaborate again on why Kılıçdaroğlu was chosen finally for the presidential candidate, because we know there was a lot of discussions over this, a lot of disagreements. The two mayors, the mayor of Istanbul, the mayor of Ankara, were originally thought to be much better prospects, but we have what we have. So as you said, some people say that he's not charismatic enough. So why wasn't perhaps a more charismatic or more sort of jolly person in terms of being able to outreach to people chosen? Why did this finally happen? Do you consider this to be a sort of a negative result coming from the opposition? Shouldn't have they put forward the best person to mobilize as many votes as possible?
I think, let me not use the term negative, but I think this is certainly a suboptimal outcome for the opposition. They certainly could have, like you mentioned, they certainly could have nominated a more popular candidate, certainly a more competent candidate who will be able to run against a younger candidate who will be able to run against Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. The problem with Kılıçdaroğlu is not only that he's uncharismatic, unenergetic campaigner and so on, but he doesn't really convey the image of being a competent politician, one that can get the job done. And I think the stereotype of, his stereotype image is that he sort of schemes behind closed doors and somehow retains control of his seat and of his party and refuses to really stand down. And ultimately, I think this is how he prevailed. Well, first of all, he's, of course, the leader of the main opposition party. So as long as he did not stand down, considering the hierarchical nature of Turkish politics, particularly how strong party leaderships are, it would have been very, very difficult for an internal challenge to emerge within CHP. And of course, Mansur Yavaş, the popular mayor of Ankara, and Ekrem İmamoğlu, the popular mayor of Istanbul, both of these mayors run under the CHP party banner. And so it would have been very, very difficult for them to stand as a candidate against Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, since the party leadership was so heavily against it. I think Kılıçdaroğlu played his cards well. You know, he's a poker player in the sense that he's very calm, silent, very patient, waits for his moment. And, you know, to his credit, to a certain extent, he cobbled together a very diverse coalition of Turkish Nationalist Party, several Islamist splinter parties, a very minor center-right party, and basically made it very, very difficult for another challenger to emerge. And he sort of postponed and to a certain extent prevented any kind of an open discussion of the other possible candidates. And so come March, you know, in this sort of crisis moment when Turkey was faced with this major earthquake disaster, the elections were coming up, and a name needed to really emerge, Kılıçdaroğlu was left as almost the only option. The other, I would say personally, a more credible candidate, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was politically banned by the Turkish courts, and so it made his candidacy rather risky. And the other available option, Mansur Yavaş, who's, by the way, quite popular, probably the most popular option out there, according to opinion polls, of course, hails from a Turkish nationalist background. So many center-left, Kurdish, far-left voters did not prefer Mansur Yavaş. So Kılıçdaroğlu, I think, very effectively eliminated those two options and ended up as the candidate. You know, this incurs some risks, and we're already seeing that. I think this should have been a very comfortable election for the opposition to win, and yet we're still seeing results to be rather very close to one another. Third-party candidates are emerging as spoilers, as potential spoilers. Muharrem İnce, the main opposition party's 2018 presidential candidate, is now running again, but this time under the banner of another party. And according to the opinion polls, he seemed to be attracting 6, 7, even 8% of the vote share, which of course is not enough to win the election, but is enough to really push the election to a second round and serve as a spoiler. So it's going to be a nerve-wracking election, I think, for both sides. The opposition could have had an easier time had they gone along with another option, but I think it's too late for that. So it's basically Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's race to lose at this point.
Yeah, he has a big job ahead of him. I mean, the future of Turkey is more or less in his hands. So very good luck to him. But apart from, I mean, him as an individual, I mean, what are going to be the biggest challenges facing the opposition alliance? I mean, can they actually hold it together until the election? I mean, stay united and have one message or several messages, but the same message on key issues?
I think it's going to be, I don't think that the opposition alliance will disintegrate until the elections, because, whichever party tries to leave or whichever party attempts to create a crisis is going to face an electoral backlash, as we've seen in the case of a good party leader Meral Akşener sort of contemplating leaving the coalition in early March, and there was a huge political backlash. So I'm not necessarily expecting any kind of a major crisis, but it's very clear that there are intra-alliance tensions between Good Party, the second largest party in the coalition, center-right / nationalist right, and CHP. There seems to be a tension on the issue of the joint MP lists that are now being prepared, because of course we're mostly focusing on the presidential elections, because the presidency is probably more important in the current system than the parliament. But the opposition, in order to change the constitution and return Turkey to a parliamentary system, need to secure a comfortable majority in the parliament. So, they need to maybe put together a joint list so that they will have an advantage against the ruling coalition. And so far, there seems to be a tough negotiations going on. The minor right-wing parties that are part of the opposition alliance are, of course, trying to get bigger concessions from CHP. The CHP base is very energized. After decades, they are so close to attaining power. And of course, there are a lot of people who want to become MPs from CHP. And they supported Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy and they want to be rewarded. So there are, I'm seeing some potential tension areas within the opposition alliance. I don't think that they're going to break out or escalate into massive crises, but they can lower the capacity of the opposition. I think the opposition faces some risks going into the campaign season. One risk is, of course, the authoritarian regime. This needs to be emphasized almost in answering, I think, every question that you've asked so far. Elections are neither free nor fair in the country. The media is heavily biased towards the government. The bureaucracy sides with the government. So this is really not a democratic context. And so the opposition parties are going to encounter significant pressure from the state bureaucracy when they campaign. They're not going to have access to the media very effectively. And so for them, campaigning will be difficult. They need to be on the ground. They need to be campaigning hard. And they really need to directly appeal to the voters because they won't have access to appeal to them through other channels. They can use social media, of course, but social media is mostly dominated by the opposition voters. But in order to have access to pro-government voters, they need to be on the ground. And this is not all that easy. I think the second major challenge that they're going to face is the extraordinary conditions created by the earthquake. As I already mentioned to you, probably 2.5 million people left the earthquake area. Many of them are not, by the way, re-registered, so they may not be able to vote. We don't know, we don't know how the voting process will take place in the earthquake-affected areas. We don't know if the opposition parties will be able to protect the ballot boxes across the country. In major cities where the CHP has strong organizations, they can, but what about the rest of the country? So that, I think, is a significant challenge that they need to overcome. And then, of course, when it comes to specific issues, I know that the opposition alliance, the nation's alliance, put together a comprehensive program that could serve as a government program if they were to win the presidency. But at the same time, I come across these leaders deliver different messages. And so there might be a cacophony of different political messages, different emphasis, and that might be a problem. If I were the candidate himself, if I were Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, I would definitely use the two popular mayors very effectively and very regularly, because these two popular mayors, Ekrem İmamoğlu from Istanbul, Mansur Yavaş from Ankara, they're well liked by the people. They have executive experience. They talk about bread and butter issues. And especially in the earthquake damaged area where people are really, really worried about what is to come. They've lost their belongings, they lost their houses. Where are they going to live in 6 months' time? Mayors can really persuade some of these voters to switch their support to the opposition. So if I were Kılıçdaroğlu, I would definitely try to use these mayors very effectively.
No, that's a really good pointer. I hope he's listening to this webinar. Just on the issue of the people who are being displaced, I mean, is it as difficult to vote? To register to vote in the presidential, or it is as it is for the parliamentary election? Because I'd heard that you could basically vote anywhere in the presidential election. You could go to a local municipality and vote. I mean, you didn't need to be registered somewhere. Is that true or not?
No, I don't think that it's true. Just a couple of weeks after the earthquake, a pro-government official made such a statement, but they needed to change the electoral law in order to make that a possibility. So, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but what I know is that you can basically only vote in the area where you're officially registered. So, you know, there's a district, and within that district, you're given a particular school where you have a ballot box, and you can only vote in that ballot box, both for the presidential and the parliamentary elections. And this is a major, I think, issue for the opposition, because according to the official figures, only you know, out of these nearly 2.5 million people who left the earthquake area, only 340,000 of them registered, you know, re-registered their addresses. So at this point, a substantial number of voters will either need to go back to the earthquake area on election day to vote, and I don't find that to be very likely, or they won't be able to vote. Because the final date to change your address was March 18th, so it passed. Now, you could go to your local election board and make an appeal and try to change your address, but that's more difficult, and you physically need to go through the trouble of doing that. For many of these people whose lives are completely devastated by the earthquake, some of them lost their homes, others lost their family members. I don't think that they're going to go through that trouble. So first of all, we're going to experience, I think, and I fear, a reduction, a decline in the level of electoral participation, certainly in the earthquake damaged area. And of course, in those places, you know, where in certain districts, 50, 60,000 of the buildings are inhospitable, I don't know where the voting places will be established. And this being an authoritarian regime, the ruling party can easily, for instance, increase the number of polling stations in areas where their level of support is high, and reduce the number of polling stations in areas where they are underrepresented. You know, and in terms of, for instance, earthquake relief efforts, my sense and what I've seen so far, you know, what I've gathered so far, is that you know, this government is following a very partisan agenda. It's basically shifting relief resources, relief aid, to those areas where it gets more votes, completely ignoring the areas where it doesn't have high level of support. So we may be seeing a very unbalanced picture. Because, you know, in my own echo chamber, when I follow the opposition media, when I, you know, follow my Twitter feed, I get a sense that everyone is really angry. And of course, the news coming from the earthquake area is very anti-government. Well, because, you know, where opposition voters are living or used to live, government is not really providing substantial earthquake relief. But there might be a bias there. So in pro-government areas, the situation may be slightly you know, slightly different. So, you know, there are many factors that we don't know how they will play out on election day, because the earthquake, the magnitude being so high, you know, the earthquake being so devastating, it's basically we're in uncharted territory. And I'm sounding pessimistic because I think under an authoritarian regime, you need to be very vigilant about these kind of government interventions. Maybe some of these points that I've raised will happen, and then that's all the better. But I think the opposition runs these risks.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising these points, because I think they're really important. And that brings me to the question regarding the Kurdish vote. I mean, the People's Democracy Party, the HDP. I mean, in previous elections, I mean, the Kurds have been like a kingmaker. So what's now the position of the Kurds? I mean, are they sort of in the process of being of the HDP? I mean, of being sort of with the opposition alliance, or is this something that's still, you know, an unknown?
Well, technically, if Turkey was a democracy, Kurdish voters and certainly the pro-Kurdish HDP would have been a kingmaker. The problem is, in order to prevent that from materializing, the regime shifted in a very authoritarian direction. June 2015 elections, HDP scored a major electoral victory, obtained 13.2, I think, % of the vote share, received 80 MPs out of 550, which was their highest limit. So normally, under normal circumstances in a democratic regime, they would have been the kingmaker. But the Turkish Ultra-Nationalist Party refused to negotiate with HDP, refused to enter into a coalition government that would be supported by HDP from outside. And over time, Erdoğan accumulated more powers, and basically we transitioned from a parliamentary regime where HDP would have been the kingmaker to a presidential system with very limited checks and balances. Now, yes, you're right. Again, HDP is emerging, and I think, especially in the parliamentary elections, they will be because I'm predicting at this point a hung parliament where neither the Nations Alliance nor the ruling coalition will be able to retain majority, and HDP will be the deciding factor. And even in the presidential elections, I think HDP can play, or Kurdish voters can play an important role. But I still fear that in order to prevent that, we may experience again an authoritarian shift. So I should probably point that out. Now, HDP has not officially endorsed a candidate. There is, I think, internally still a debate within the party leadership as to whether or not they should nominate their own candidate and then negotiate a deal before the second round of the presidential elections, or they should basically refuse to nominate a candidate and maybe loosely, informally support Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Probably they're going to go with the latter option, but there are some figures who advocate the former position as well. If they go with the latter option, in other words, if they don't nominate another candidate, probably Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is going to get majority of the HDP support. But I don't know if that would be sufficient for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to win the presidential elections outright in the first round. If that doesn't happen, then we may experience a repeat of what transpired in Turkey between June and November 2015. Escalation of violence, maybe attacks on Kurdish, heavily Kurdish populated provinces, government-sponsored accusations leveled against the opposition alliance that they are teaming up with HDP, with PKK. Then I think it would be a very uncertain scenario. So I think it's not clear yet how it will play out. And there is also, of course, also a court case against HDP. I don't know if there will be sufficient time left for the Constitutional Court to ban HDP, but there is an ongoing case that could result in HDP getting closed by the Constitutional Court, which is why HDP politicians are now openly contemplating the scenario that they're going to run their candidates under the banner of another party. Right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, even though we only have 7 weeks left until the first round of the presidential elections.
That sounds like Turkey, yeah, to be honest, to be franker. You mentioned, a lot of the problems that could happen around the vote. The unfair playing field, problems on the day, fraud and stuff like this. Could another issue potentially be, or is probably happening already, Russian interference into the process? Because we know that the Russians probably want Erdoğan to remain, the good friend of Putin. Is this a significant threat?
I think it is, but of course, the Russian government has already intervened in the electoral process by basically giving Erdoğan's government substantial economic benefits. For instance, the Russian government already postponed Turkey's payment for the Russian gas, and I don't know the full figure, but we're talking about at least an amount that is over 15 billion US dollars, maybe even more. Right? That's more substantial than what the EU in its entirety pledged in this donor conference. The Russians provided a credit for the construction of a nuclear power plant in Mersin, in the Mediterranean coast. There's also Gulf money coming into Turkey over the past year. I think this foreign funding has allowed Erdoğan to keep Turkish lira stable at a time when his government, or at a time when the central bank lowered the Turkish interest rate beneath the inflation rate, beneath even the official inflation rate. So there's already been, I think, a significant amount of foreign intervention in the political process. We've never really seen something like this in the previous elections. What else can Putin do? I think he could have given the green light for Turkey to stage a small-scale military operation in northern Syria. But of course, post-earthquake, I doubt that will happen. There could be some Russian support for a disinformation manipulation campaign. But I think the Turkish government already has the resources to manipulate social media to a certain extent. Where Putin might be, where else Putin can support Erdoğan? Well, maybe on election night, if Erdoğan engages in some level of electoral irregularities, maybe even small scale of fraud. Of course, if Putin recognizes Erdoğan, that would be a huge coup for him. Now, I'm not necessarily contemplating a Lukashenko scenario. I don't expect and think that the Erdoğan administration can really steal a substantial number of votes. I'm not expecting a large-scale electoral fraud, but in a very tight race, Erdoğan can change the figures to a certain extent, and then if he gets approval from Beijing, from the Gulf states, from Putin, that gives him some level of legitimacy. So there are certain things that Putin can do additionally, but he has already helped Erdoğan substantially already.
Yeah, I was just going to make reference to the visit of the Chinese president to Moscow, in his, him sort of underlining the legitimacy of Putin, which of course he is anything but legitimate. So I just want to turn now a bit to foreign policy, because we only have 10 minutes left, and unfortunately I see that Nazlan hasn't been able to join us. And I want to just start by putting the first question that we actually had here from Anahid Pilibosyan, who was asking about the perception of Armenia's humanitarian support and the visit of the Armenian foreign minister to Ankara during and after the earthquake. I mean, how was it seen? And do you think this, this is my part of the question, do you think this opens the way for, a more speedy normalization of relations with Armenia?
I think the Armenian humanitarian support for Turkey after the earthquake certainly generated some level of goodwill among the electorate. But I think any kind of a political opening or some kind of a, in order for some kind of a diplomatic reconciliation to take place between the two countries, you need to have some additional developments in high politics. And so nothing will happen until the upcoming elections. And after that, depending on the results, depending on who comes to power, we may see an opening. Erdoğan has already been sort of negotiating with the Azeris and trying to sort of use its access to the Putin administration to make some kind of a deal with Armenia. But from what I gather, no substantial ground was covered. Post-election, if Erdoğan needs international support, if he needs international goodwill, this could be one issue that he could use. But post-election, we might experience a completely different Turkey, and whatever I predict might become obsolete. But until the election, I don't predict any major development in the foreign policy area.
Okay, but let's just imagine that the opposition win. Can you give me sort of a brief assessment of what this would mean, first of all, for relations with the EU? As I said at the beginning, they've been in a very bad state of affairs for a long time. So would you expect them to be reinvigorated? I mean, how far do you think this could go? Could we even see a sort of, reopening of Turkey's accession negotiations, or is that something that's really, dead as a dodo?
Well, of course, it would be my hope that that Turkey's accession talks with the EU would resume, but I doubt that it would happen. I think it will be an overly optimistic point. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is not necessarily known for his diplomatic experience, and so far he's been very enigmatic when it comes to the foreign policy positions that he has taken. His statements have been all over the place. It's not, at least to me, clear where he stands. But my sense is that certainly CHP is going to revert back to a more traditional Turkish foreign policy positions, which would tilt Turkey more in the direction of the West. I think if the opposition were to prevail in the upcoming elections, there will be a concerted effort by the new government to sort of pull itself out of the Russian orbit, to have more extensive ties with the US and the EU. S-400 missile defense system, that could be one issue where I think substantial ground can be covered. But having said that, I think some of the, and I think we're going to, under a new government, we're going to revert back to a more institutionalized way of conducting Turkish foreign policy. Because one major problem that we've seen, especially over the past decade, is that, policymaking process shifted out of the hands of the Turkish Foreign Ministry into the presidency, with basically Erdoğan calling all the shots together with a small circle of advisors. And that has really turned, that has really weakened Turkey within the organizations that it's a member of. And it really sort of pushed for the creation of these bilateral ties between Erdoğan and Putin, and Erdoğan and Aliyev and some other leaders out there. I think we're going to revert back to Turkish Foreign Ministry calling the shots, which of course will be a good thing. But of course, having said that, I think Turkey and EU have some diverging interests and some issues that will take time to address and resolve. The East Mediterranean crisis, Cyprus, the migration crisis. I think the new government will have different positions than what EU would prefer Turkey to follow. And of course, if the opposition prevails, we will probably experience some level of democratization, which means that the public sentiment will become more important over the foreign policy making process. And so, for instance, with regards to the migration issue, I don't predict that it's going to be a big issue in this electoral cycle. But in a post-Erdoğan Turkey, it will be a major issue because there won't be government to sort of put a lid on that question. So Turkey will come back to the negotiation table. There will not be populist-style crises erupting, but the policy positions that the new government will take, I think, will diverge from the EU positions, and then there will be tough negotiations.
And how, in the same way, how do you see, the relationship with the United States? Because there's also been a lot of problems there. I mean, would the opposition, if it doesn't happen beforehand, which doesn't seem likely, immediately ratify Sweden's membership of NATO? Would they? I mean, you mentioned Russia briefly. I mean, are we going to see maybe not a total abandonment of Russia, but a much more robust position vis-a-vis Ukraine? Because I mean, at the minute, the Erdoğan and his government have one foot in each camp. I mean, is there going to be a change? So it's like, let's say 90% with Ukraine and 10% with Russia, if that. I mean, is that really feasible? I mean, given the fact that Russia has significant influence in some of the areas of Turkish foreign policy interests in the neighborhood.
Well, the foreign policy issues have not necessarily been at the forefront of the opposition's agenda. And, at least to me, it's not even clear who will be Turkey's next foreign minister if the opposition were to win. And I think that says something. There's some contenders, some candidates, but there's no clear-cut official who would inherit that ministerial position, the way that, for instance, there are some contenders for Ministry of Economics. So that says something. I think, under an opposition-controlled government, Turkey will try to move away from its current balancing act vis-a-vis Russia and West and Ukraine, probably tilt towards the West, but I don't think they will go as far as 90% West, 10% Russia, as you put it, because the new government will need to pay for a substantial amount of money to Russia for gas deliveries. It'll be 2 years worth of money. And the new government will already be facing significant domestic challenges. And so they wouldn't necessarily want any kind of crisis to emerge vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis some other countries. So I think the new government will tilt towards the West, but depending on the goodwill it will receive from the West, that tilt will continue or it will stop at some point. So S-400, I think, is, for instance, a concrete issue area where the new government can make some concessions. I think Sweden vote may happen within the first year. I'm more optimistic on that account, but but I think we should not lose track of the fact that there will be a nationalist party in this new coalition if the opposition were to win. And also CHP has different factions when it comes to foreign policy issues, ranging from more neo-nationalist, somewhat anti-Western, anti-US factions to more pro-European, center-left, social democratic factions. And Kılıçdaroğlu is not, I think, strong enough or competent enough in this area to be able to pull together everyone. So I think they're going to take small steps. And then it really comes down to how the West would react to an opposition victory. Will they open up the coffers and say, great, we need a new government, we need a stable Turkey, let's pump money, send foreign investments to Turkey? That might generate a different response from the government. If they sit on the fence, I think the new government cannot make major concessions, at least within the first year or so. But this is pure speculation because they're not talking much about foreign policy issues.
I mean, I think they should, have open arms to be ready to embrace the new president, the new government. And I hope that the Turkey's Western partners, including the EU, or perhaps mainly the EU, should already have a proper, strategy and roadmap as to how they're going to work with the new government, what's going to be the priorities and whatnot, and how they're going to reset the relations. I'm not sure whether that exists, but I certainly hope, because this would be a major change. A lifetime change even actually in Turkey, so it needs to be embraced fully. But my last question, because I say we only have like 1 minute left, is, what would happen to Erdoğan if he loses? I think this is a question on many people's minds. Would he be just walk away, go and live somewhere in back to Trabzon or somewhere on the Black Sea, where he came from? Or is there a risk that there could be, something more sinister that would await him? How would that be dealt with?
It's difficult to really come up with an accurate prediction on Erdoğan's destiny if he were to lose the election, because we're really uncharted territory. We've never really had a leader who's been in power for over 2 decades, basically since Turkey's transition to multi-party rule in 1950. Of course, Erdoğan's regime has been extremely corrupt, so it wouldn't surprise me if the new government decides to pursue some of these cases. But I have a rather more optimistic take on post-Erdoğan Turkey, in the sense that it'll be very, very difficult and probably politically unwise for the new government to try to prosecute Erdoğan. Probably Erdoğan would be safe. And he may be given a safe way out, but some of his henchmen, some of his colleagues may face prosecution, but that will probably not be Erdoğan's problem. So if he loses with a comfortable margin, I don't think that he'll be able to steal the election the way that, for instance, Lukashenko did in Belarus. Now, he's already 70 years old, looks physically frail. If he were to be 10 years younger and physically more fit, it would not have surprised me that he would have stayed on and tried to fight and remain in the opposition and challenge the new government, ask for early elections, and maybe come back to power after a few years. But considering his old age, considering his physical capacity, I don't know if he'll be able to hang on for a long time, because populist leaders, when they lose elections, they don't wither away. Trump is still around, Bolsonaro is still around, Berlusconi has been around for a long, we've had cases of populist leaders, even with a high dose of authoritarianism, come back or try to come back, and Erdoğan may contemplate that. But I think it's going to be tough. If he loses, I'm more pessimistic about the campaign process. But if he loses and steps down, I'm more optimistic. I think things will change in Turkish politics.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to end this conversation. I mean, I could keep talking to you for hours, actually. Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating to hear your insights and your, ideas and your sort of perceptions on what we might expect. I hope that it was an interesting exchange for you as well, Berk. I'm really grateful that you were able to give the time for this discussion. Again, I'm sorry that Nazlan was not able to join us, but I hope that we'll have her again on another occasion. I mean, EPC is going to be following very closely the elections and then the post-election situation in Turkey, both in events and publications through our Global Türkiye initiative. I want to thank the audience very much for joining, for the questions that were put, and wish all of you a great evening. And to you again, Berk, good luck with the next 2 months. We'll all be thinking about Turkey, me as well, obviously, because my family is also Turkey and my children are Turks, so it's also a big deal. So thanks a lot and have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Have a nice evening.